I froze, staring at the grainy screen of the baby monitor. The room upstairs was dark, only the night vision mode was on, turning everything into shades of ghostly green and black. On the screen I could see my own reflection. I was standing over Leo's crib, tucking his blanket around him. But I wasn't watching in real time. It was a recording, made barely a minute earlier, just before I had returned to the living room. I pressed pause. My fingers were trembling so badly the device nearly slipped from my hands. On the screen, directly behind my back, from the corner where there should have been nothing but an empty wall, a shadow was slowly peeling itself away. It was 2 heads taller than me. Unnader heads taller than me. Unnaturally thin, like chewing gum stretched too far. And while my digital image carefully tucked the baby in, that shadow leaned slowly toward my ear. I remembered the moment, the sudden chill against my neck that I had dismissed as a draft. Now I was seeing the truth. The shadow opened its mouth, and I watched my image on the screen jerk violently, as if struck by electricity, though in reality I hadn't heard a thing. I don't know who will ever find this recording. The police said it was just a technical glitch and compression artifacts. But they didn't see what happened next. They didn't smell the stench of rotting seaweed in a perfectly dry room. If you're listening to this, understand something. Sometimes technology doesn't merely record reality. Sometimes it shows us what's standing right behind us while we try very hard not to turn around. Cameras see what we prefer not to notice. The house stood at the very edge of the Cape, where the coastline of Maine cuts into the Atlantic with razor-sharp cliffs. It was an imposing Victorian structure the locals called the Widow's House. 3 stories clad in dark cedar that, after years of salt wind and weather, had taken on the color of dried bone. The narrow windows in its turreted towers resembled narrowed eyes watching the road below. As I parked my old Toyota on the gravel driveway, I felt something strange, not fear exactly, but a heaviness. As if the air here weighed more than it did in the city. Mrs. Whitmore met me at the door. She was young, yet looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, restless hands constantly adjusting the collar of her blouse. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Sarah," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "My husband and I desperately need this dinner. We haven't slept properly in a week." Inside, the house smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and something else, faint, sweet, and damp, like stagnant water in a flower pot. The floors were wide oak planks that seemed to groan beneath every step, as though protesting the intrusion. We climbed to the 2nd floor by a broad staircase. The banister felt cold and oddly tacky to the touch despite being impeccably clean. "Leo just fell asleep, Mrs. Whitmore whispered as she opened the nursery door. The room was spacious with a high ceiling. In the center stood a massive antique crib, clearly passed down through generations. On the dresser beside it blinked the green light of the baby monitor transmitter. It was an expensive model, with a large screen on the parent unit and a recording function. "He sleeps deeply," she assured me. "But this house. It's noisy. Old pipes, the foundation settling. Sometimes it sounds like someone's walking upstairs, but it's just the beams cooling. Don't pay attention to it. Here's the monitor. The signal even reaches the veranda, but please stay in the living room. Before leaving, Mr. Whitmore," A tall man with a firm handshake and darting eyes, added something peculiar. If you hear interference on the monitor, just reboot it. Sometimes it picks up radio hobbyists or taxi frequencies. And, Sarah, don't open the attic door. The lock sticks, and then it won't shut properly. Causes drafts. When the heavy oak door closed behind them, the silence descended instantly. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty apartment. It was a silence that listens. I bolted the door, checked the windows, and settled into the living room on the first floor. I placed the baby monitor on the coffee table in front of me. The screen glowed softly, showing Leo asleep. His chest rose and fell steadily. The image was clear, though occasionally a faint ripple passed across it, as if an invisible finger were brushing the camera lens upstairs. The first hour passed quietly. I scrolled through my phone, trying to ignore the sounds of the house. There were many. The house lived its own life. Somewhere deep within the walls, water dripped. The floorboards upstairs would occasionally emit a dry crack, like the snap of an air rifle. The ocean wind strengthened, and the old window frames began rattling in their grooves. I glanced at the monitor. 9:45 p.m. Leo was sleeping in the same position. But something had changed. The sound. From the baby monitor's speaker, which had until then carried only steady white noise, came a strange rustling. Like dry fabric dragging across wood. Zhk. Zhk. Rhythmic. Slow. I turned up the volume. The sound became clearer. It resembled footsteps, someone walking across carpet in soft socks, shuffling. But the screen showed no one. Only the crib and the motionless shadows of furniture. Just interference, I said aloud. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the vast living room. I picked up the monitor, studying the pixels. The camera faced the crib but captured part of the room, a rocking chair in the corner and the nursery door misses. Whitmore had left slightly ajar. Suddenly the image glitched. Horizontal bands of distortion streaked across the screen, and the sound turned into a high, piercing squeal that made me wince and lower the volume. When the picture stabilized, the rocking chair was moving. I froze. The motion was slight, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Back and forth. Back and forth. A draft, I told myself. Mr. Whitmore had mentioned faulty locks and gaps. The wind outside was strong. Of course it was a draft. I tried to return to my phone, but my eyes kept drifting back to the small screen. The chair stopped. But now the shadows in the room seemed thicker. The night vision mode gave everything unnatural contrast. The corners drowned in absolute black. That's when I saw it for the first time. In the upper right corner of the screen, where the camera captured the ceiling molding, a blot appeared. It was darker than the surrounding shadow. It was moving. Slowly, like thick tar, it slid down the wall. I lifted the screen closer to my eyes. This wasn't an insect on the lens. It was in the room. The blot elongated, forming the outline of something long and thin. An arm? No, too many joints. A finger? Far too long. It touched the top edge of the nursery door and stilled. What the hell? I whispered. At that moment, Leo stirred in the crib. He whimpered, not fully awake but clearly disturbed. I jumped to my feet. I had to check. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was a trick of light, a cheap camera glitch, maybe a spider crawling over the lens. But instinct, ancient and unerring, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I climbed the stairs, stepping along the edges to avoid creaks. The upstairs hallway was cold. Much colder than downstairs. The air smelled damp and carried that same sweet rot, now tinged with faint ozone, like before a storm. The nursery door was ajar exactly as I had seen on the screen. I pushed it open. Silence. Leo slept. The rocking chair stood still. The corner where I'd seen the shadow was just wallpaper patterned with flowers. No blot. No tar. I exhaled shakily. Paranoia, Sarah, I muttered. You've watched too many horror movies. I approached the crib to pull the blanket back over Leo's legs. In my left hand I held the parent unit of the monitor, using its glow instead of turning on the main light and waking him. I leaned over the crib. My eyes fell on the monitor screen at my waist. The camera, mounted high on the opposite shelf, filmed me from behind and slightly above. On the screen I saw my back, my hair tied in a ponytail, my hands adjusting the blanket. And I saw that I was not alone. Directly behind me, towering over me, stood something. It resembled a person, but distorted, as if reflected in a warped mirror stretched vertically. Its limbs were unnaturally long, shoulders narrow and blade-like. Its head. It had no face. Just a smooth, glossy surface where eyes and mouth should have been. It stood so close its ribcage nearly touched my back. I froze. My body turned to stone. In reality, my eyes looked forward at the sleeping baby and the opposite wall. No one was there. My peripheral vision confirmed an empty room. But the screen in my hand showed a different reality. On the monitor, the creature slowly raised its arm. Fingers long as knitting needles, with too many knuckles, reached toward my neck. And I felt it. Not flesh. Cold. A piercing, icy cold touching the base of my skull, exactly where those hideous fingers hovered on the screen. Panic surged through me. I spun around, swinging my free arm. Nothing. An empty room. Old toys stared at me with glass eyes. Curtains stirred faintly from a draft. I looked back at the monitor. On the screen I stood alone in the room, turning in confusion. The creature was gone. Oh God, I breathed. I have to leave. I backed toward the door, eyes fixed on the crib. I couldn't leave Leo. But taking him. Did I even have the right? If this was hallucination, I'd be arrested for kidnapping. If it wasn't. I ran into the hallway, slammed the nursery door shut, and pressed my back against it. My heart hammered in my throat. The monitor flickered again. The nursery appeared. Leo sleeping. But the interference was stronger now. The image tore apart in digital noise. And through that static, I heard a voice. Not a baby crying. A whisper. It came from the speaker, but sounded as though the speaker itself were speaking from within. She sees us, it hissed. Dry. Scraping. Like two stones grinding together. Mommy, she sees, answered another voice, childlike, but warped, as if filtered through an ancient radio. Horror rooted me in place. The camera was aimed at the closed door, the very door I was leaning against from the other side. On the screen, the door began to open. Behind my back, I felt the wood tremble. The handle pressed into my spine and started to turn. I leapt away. In reality, the door remained shut. The handle didn't move. But on the monitor, the door swung wide. And in the doorway stood the creature. Only now I saw there were two. Beside the tall figure stood something smaller, child-sized, but with the same elongated limbs and blank head. They entered the room on the screen. They approached the crib. In reality, Leo began to cry, soft at first, then escalating into hysterical screams. On the screen, the tall figure bent over the crib. Its long fingers slid between the bars. I couldn't wait. To hell with the police. To hell with everything. I yanked the door open. The room hit me with an icy gust of wind, though the windows were closed. The smell of rot was unbearable now, mixed with a metallic tang like blood. Leo was screaming, choking on his cries. I rushed to the crib and scooped him up without even wrapping him in the blanket. His skin was ice cold. I turned to run. My eyes fell on the monitor I had dropped onto the rocking chair. It lay face up. On the screen I saw myself clutching the baby. And around me stood them. Not two. Dozens. The entire room on the monitor was filled with tall, thin shadows. They formed a tight ring around me, heads bowed. They were everywhere, by the wardrobe, on the ceiling hanging like bats, clustered by the door. In reality, the room looked empty. But I felt them against my skin. The air thickened like gelatin. It was like wading through deep water. Get away! I screamed into the void. I forced myself toward the door, pushing through invisible resistance. I felt icy touches on my arms, my face. Something tugged at my hair. Hundreds of whispers merged into one deafening murmur. Leave him. He's ours. Leave. I burst into the hallway, nearly tripping on the threshold. The staircase seemed endless. The steps creaked beneath me, and the creaking sounded like laughter. On the first floor I didn't bother searching for my car keys. I ran straight through the front door into the night, clutching Leo. Gravel tore at my bare feet. I'd lost my shoes somewhere on the stairs. I sprinted to my car, praying it was unlocked. Thank God I never locked it in such isolation. I tossed Leo onto the back seat, jumped behind the wheel, and started the engine. In the headlights, the house looked like a giant black skull. The nursery windows were dark. But as I backed down the driveway, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The nursery window glowed. Not electric light. A faint green glow, like the baby monitor screen. And in that window stood Mrs. Whitmore. She pressed her hands against the glass. But her silhouette was wrong. Her neck was too long, her head tilted sharply to the side, nearly touching her shoulder. Beside her stood Mr. Whitmore. His jaw hung open in a silent scream far wider than any human mouth could stretch. They waved. Slowly. In perfect synchrony. With long, jointed fingers. I drove until the engine began to smoke, straight to the nearest police station. Of course, they didn't believe me. They called the Whitmores. The couple arrived an hour later, looking perfectly normal, worried, frightened parents. They claimed they had been at a restaurant 40 miles away, complete with receipts and witnesses. They didn't press charges only because, according to the police, I had saved their child from a gas leak. An old boiler. Carbon monoxide. A classic explanation. But I kept the recording. The one from the baby monitor's flash drive that I had instinctively yanked out before fleeing. I don't know why I did it. Maybe to prove to myself I wasn't insane. I've watched it hundreds of times. It shows me entering the room. It shows me leaning over the crib. And it shows the shadow peeling away from the wall. But the worst part comes at the end, after I've already run out with the baby. The camera continues filming the empty nursery. The door slowly closes by itself. Then the rocking chair begins to sway, faster and faster. And then a face approaches the camera. Right up to the lens. It's Mrs. Whitmore's face. But her eyes are completely black. No whites at all. And she's smiling. Her mouth is filled with small, sharp teeth like a deep-sea fish. She presses a finger to her lips and whispers a single word. The audio is distorted, but you can make it out. She says, almost. I don't work as a nanny anymore. I live in a studio apartment downtown where the streetlights never go out and traffic noise never stops. I own no mirrors. I taped over the webcam on my laptop. I threw away my smartphone and use an old button phone without a camera. Because I know now, they aren't tied to the house. They live in the signal. In the pixels. In the interference between frames. And sometimes, when I pass store windows filled with television screens, I catch, in the reflection behind me, a tall, thin shadow. And it's getting closer. I sat on their couch, gripping the tablet so hard my knuckles turned white. Frozen on the screen was a single frame, a grainy, black and white image of a nursery, captured in night vision mode. In the corner, leaning over their son's crib, stood a dark figure with long hair. I turned the screen to show the parents, expecting them to call the police. Expecting panic. But the father, Mark, just went pale, and the mother, Sarah, covered her mouth with her hand, not out of fear for her son. She looked at her husband and whispered, her voice trembling, Mark. We took the camera down from that corner 3 months ago. There's nothing there now but a blank wall. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I recognized the figure in the video. It was me. Except at the time stamped on the footage, 3:14 a.m. I had been sleeping downstairs in the living room, under the watchful gaze of two other lenses. This story really happened to me, and ever since, I cover every webcam on my laptop and every lens on my phone with black electrical tape. Because now I know, just because a device is off doesn't mean it isn't watching. Technology isn't always on our side. It all started with a simple ad on a professional nanny website. Overnight infant caregiver needed. Experience required. Excellent pay. Smart home. The last phrase was in bold, as if it were the main selling point. Back then, I was living in Florida, renting a tiny studio with a broken air conditioner, and desperately needed money. The amount they were offering for a single night would cover 2 weeks of my rent. The house was in a gated community where the streets were too clean and the lawns an unnaturally vivid green for the arid August heat. It was one of those high-tech buildings, a cube of concrete, glass, and dark wood. No unnecessary details, no potted plants by the entrance. Just smooth surfaces and cameras. I counted 3 before I even reached the massive front door. The door swung open silently before I could ring the bell. Mark stood there. He looked like a typical tech entrepreneur who'd made millions from a startup, an expensive t-shirt, wire-rimmed glasses, and a smartwatch on his wrist glowing with a soft orange light. Inside, it was cool. After the wet, clinging heat of the Florida evening, the air in the house felt sterile, almost clinical. It smelled of ozone and something synthetic, like the scent of new electronics fresh out of their boxes. "We're obsessed with security, Anna," Mark said, bypassing a greeting and leading me into the living room. "This isn't just a house. It's an ecosystem." Sarah, his wife, looked tired. She was holding 6-month-old Leo and glancing nervously at a wall-mounted control panel, a sleek black rectangle built directly into the drywall. The tour took longer than the introduction to the child. Mark proudly demonstrated the system. Lights switched on automatically as we entered a room and dimmed smoothly behind us. The blinds reacted to UV levels. In every single room, small spherical cameras hung near the ceiling. "They record to the cloud 24/7, Mark explained, noticing me looking at a lens in the kitchen. "Only Sarah and I have access. But onto this tablet." He handed me a heavy iPad in a rubberized case. "We've set up the controls for the nursery zone for you. You'll see the temperature, humidity, noise levels, and, of course, the baby monitor." He tapped the icon for the OmniGuard app. The screen flickered, and a grid of 4 cameras appeared. The nursery, the hallway, the living room, and the backyard. "And what are those sensors?" I asked, pointing to strange black strips running along the baseboards. "LiDARs," Mark said casually. "They scan the room's volume. If someone enters, the system doesn't detect motion in the video feed, it detects a change in the spatial geometry. No false alarms. Even if a burglar wore an invisibility cloak, to the LiDAR, they'd just be a physical object." It sounded impressive and a little unsettling. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, standard procedure for wealthy families, and they left for a charity dinner. Left alone, I felt like a grain of sand inside a giant computer. Leo was asleep in his crib upstairs. I sat downstairs in the spacious living room, lit only by the blue glow of a massive television and the tablet's interface. The silence in this house was unique. It wasn't the natural silence of a settling house, with the occasional creak of floorboards or gurgle of pipes. No, here the silence was like a vacuum. The soundproofing cut out the chirping of cicadas and the distant hum of cars. The only sound was a low, barely perceptible hum. The hum of servers hidden somewhere in the basement. The hum of air conditioners maintaining a perfect 71 degrees. The hum of a life that wasn't alive. The first hour passed peacefully. I read a book, occasionally glancing at the tablet. Leo slept, his little arms thrown wide. The nursery camera provided a clear, grayscale image. The breathing indicator pulsed rhythmically green. Around 11 o'clock, the first strange thing happened. I went to the kitchen to get some water. The light, as Mark had promised, came on by itself. But when I'd filled my glass and turned to leave, the light in the living room went out. I stood there in the brightly lit kitchen, staring into the darkness of the vast great room. "Okay, smart house," I whispered. "Not so smart." I took a step into the darkness, expecting the motion sensors to kick in. Nothing. I waved my hand. The darkness remained impenetrable. Only a faint glow from the streetlights seeped through the gaps in the automated blinds, painting barcode-like stripes on the floor. I had to feel my way back to the couch, using my phone screen as a feeble torch. The moment I sat down, the living room lights blazed on at full intensity, blinding me. I blinked, trying to adjust. A notification popped up on the tablet. Manual lighting scenario adjustment, guessed. I frowned. I hadn't adjusted anything. I hadn't even touched the lighting menu. Picking up the tablet, I checked the event log. 11:12 p.m., presence sensor, living room active. 11:14 p.m., presence sensor, kitchen active. 11:15 p.m., lighting module synchronization failure. Rebooting. Just a glitch, I thought. Technology is technology. The more complex the system, the more holes it has. I looked back at the nursery camera. Leo was asleep. Everything was calm. But something about the image felt different. I pinched to zoom in. A stuffed elephant was hanging on the crib rail. I distinctly remembered that when I'd put Leo down, the elephant was lying in the corner of the crib, near his feet. Now it was draped over the rail, as if someone had moved it. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe Leo had woken up, played for a bit, and gone back to sleep. But I hadn't been away from the monitor for more than a minute while getting water. And the noise sensor had stayed silent. I decided to go up and check. The staircase was made of tempered glass, and each of my steps echoed with a dull thud that the house seemed to amplify intentionally. Reaching the second floor, I approached the nursery door. It was slightly ajar. I froze. I had closed it. I remembered the click of the magnetic lock. I always close doors so the hallway light doesn't disturb the children. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, lit only by a nightlight projector casting faint stars across the ceiling. Leo was asleep. The elephant. The elephant was at the foot of the crib, right where I'd left it. I exhaled. My imagination. Just a camera perspective trick. Wide-angle lenses often distort distances and shapes. I went back downstairs, feeling foolish. But the unease had already settled in my solar plexus. I picked up the tablet again. The elephant on the screen was still hanging on the rail. I looked at the screen. Then I glanced up at the ceiling, visualizing where Leo's room was. Then back at the screen. It wasn't a perspective glitch. It was a delay. The image on the tablet wasn't live. It was a recording. Or a frozen frame. I poked the screen, trying to refresh the feed. The app froze. A loading wheel spun, hypnotic. Damn it, I muttered under my breath. At that moment, a sound echoed through the entire house. It was a short, melodic chime, the sound of a notification, but not from my phone. It came from speakers built into the ceiling. Motion detected in zone, main hallway, a synthetic female voice announced, completely devoid of emotion. The main hallway was upstairs. Right outside the nursery. I sprang up from the couch. On the tablet, the OmniGuard app had finally unfrozen. The image jerked and switched to real time. The nursery was empty and calm. But the hallway camera. The hallway camera showed an empty corridor. No one. Motion detected in zone, staircase, the voice announced again. I stared at the glass steps. They were empty. But on the tablet, on the thumbnail from the camera aimed at the stairs, I saw a shadow. Something dark and formless slid across the edge of the frame. My heart was pounding in my throat. I grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911. But there was no signal. In the top corner, it said, "No service." Wi-Fi calling, I remembered. In this bunker, cellular service didn't work, everything went through the internet. I looked at the router blinking in the corner of the living room. All the lights were a steady green. The internet was on. Why wasn't my phone seeing the network? Suddenly, the living room lights went out again. This time, completely. Even the streetlight vanished as the blinds hummed shut, sealing the panoramic windows tight. I was plunged into absolute darkness. Mark? Sarah? I called out, hoping it was some stupid joke or that they'd come home early and decided to test the system. Silence. Only the hum of the air conditioner grew louder, straining into a labored whine. The tablet screen was my only source of light. I clutched it to my chest, illuminating the space in front of me. The bluish light snatched the outlines of furniture from the darkness, twisting them into monstrous shapes. Then the tablet vibrated. A notification. But not from the security system. It was a message in the OmniGuard app's internal chat. Sender, admin, Mark. Message: why are you standing by his crib? I went rigid. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the device. I'm downstairs. I yelled into the void, knowing the house had microphones. Mark, I'm in the living room. A new message. Sender, admin, Mark. Message, I see you. You're standing right over him. Stop it. I switched the tab back to the nursery camera. The blood drained from my face. On the screen, in the ghastly green light of night vision, I saw a figure. It stood with its back to the camera, leaning over Leo. The figure had my long hair. It was wearing my hoodie. It stood perfectly still, unnaturally straight. But I was here. Downstairs. In the dark. Panic washed over me in a cold wave. Someone had broken in. Someone was dressed like me. I threw the tablet on the couch and bolted for the stairs. I didn't think about a weapon, didn't think about my own safety. There was a child up there. I ran up the steps, stumbling in the darkness. Motion detected in zone, staircase, the house's voice stated impassively. Motion detected in zone, second floor hall. I burst into the nursery, slapping at the light switch. Nothing. Leo. I lunged for the crib, groping in the dark. My fingers touched a warm little body. He was breathing. He was asleep. There was no one else in the room. I would have heard them. I would have felt them. The room was empty. I scooped the child into my arms. He whimpered, waking up. Shoo, shoo, I whispered, backing toward the door. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, holding Leo against my shoulder. A notification from the OmniGuard app. I'd installed it on my phone at Mark's request for backup. Face detected, Anna V. 99% match. Camera, Nursery 2. Nursery 2. I looked at my phone screen. It was a live feed. The frame showed me. I was standing in the middle of the room, holding the baby, looking around wildly. My face was twisted with fear, eyes wide. But the camera angle. The camera was looking at me from below, upward. From the corner of the room, right by the floor, from behind the nursing chair. I slowly moved my gaze to that corner. It was empty. A smooth wall, a baseboard, the leg of the chair. No camera. No lens. No eye. I looked back at the phone. On the screen, in that very same corner where the feed supposedly originated, stood a second figure. In the video, I saw myself holding the child. And behind me, reflected in the wardrobe mirror which was visible in this non-existent camera's frame, stood me. That other me. In the same hoodie. Head bowed. Her face was hidden by her hair, but her hands. Her hands were unnaturally long, and her fingers touched the floor. I screamed. I ran from the room, clutching Leo, and flew down the stairs, risking my neck. Perimeter breach, a siren wailed. Door lock activated. I reached the front door and yanked the handle. Locked. I slammed my hand on the touch panel. It glowed red, access denied. Open it. I screamed. Open the goddamn door. The siren howled, piercing my eardrums. Leo was wailing hysterically. I dashed to the panoramic window in the living room. Grabbed a heavy metal statue from the coffee table and hurled it at the glass with all my strength. The glass didn't even crack. Impact-resistant coating. Bulletproof. I was trapped. In an aquarium. And then the lights came on. Everywhere. All at once, at full power. Bright, white, surgical light. The siren stopped. An absolute silence descended. And in that silence, a voice came from the speakers. Not the house's synthetic voice, but my own voice. A recording of my voice, maybe from an hour ago, when I was talking to myself. Asterisk, okay, smart house. Not so smart. Asterisk. The phrase repeated, stuttered, changed pitch, dropping then rising, warping into a demonic screech. Asterisk, not so smart. 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 Asterisk. I cowered into the farthest corner of the kitchen, away from the windows, slid to the floor, and held the child against me. I closed my eyes and started to pray, though I'd never been religious. I could feel something watching me. Not the cameras. Something that lived inside the wires, inside the walls. We sat like that for 3 hours. At 4 a.m., the front door clicked and swung open. Mark and Sarah walked in. They were laughing, chatting about their evening, until they saw me, pale, shaking, holding their son, sitting on the kitchen floor surrounded by knives I'd pulled from the block for protection. They tried to calm me down. Mark muttered something about a server malfunction, a hack, suing the installation company. I didn't hear any of it. I just wanted to leave. Before I left, I made them look at the footage. The feed from Nursery 2. I picked up the tablet. Found the file. 3:14 a.m. The tablet screen showed the nursery. There I was, holding the baby. Looking around. And in the corner. See? I yelled, jabbing my finger at the long-limbed figure behind me. Mark frowned. He took the tablet, held it closer. Then he looked at Sarah. Sarah went pale, as if she'd seen a ghost, but not on the screen. Anna, Mark said quietly. What are you talking about? He turned the tablet towards me. In the video, I was holding the child. I was screaming at nothing. There was no one behind me. The wardrobe mirror reflected an empty room. But the camera. I whispered. The angle. Where did that angle come from? Mark gave me a strange look. Anna, we don't have a camera in that corner. We took it down when Leo started crawling because he kept pulling the cord. There's no device in the system named Nursery 2. This file. It's flagged as system error. He was telling the truth. I could see it in his eyes. He really didn't understand. But I know what I saw. And I know that when I was running for the exit that night, I felt cold breath on the back of my neck. Breath that smelled not of ozone, but of damp earth. I quit that same morning. I left Florida a week later. Now I live in an old house, where doors lock with ordinary iron keys, and windows open with wooden frames. I have a flip phone. I don't have internet at home. But sometimes, at night, when I'm lying in bed and listening to the silence, I think I can hear it again. That faint, barely there hum. The hum of a processor, processing data. And yesterday I found a new picture on my old digital camera, which has been sitting in a desk drawer without a battery for 2 years. It's a picture of me, asleep in my bed, taken from a ceiling angle. In the corner of the frame is a date, last night. And written across the photo in bright red digital pixels is a caption. Smart. I froze when 5-year-old Toby stopped dragging his red marker across the paper. The room went so silent I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. He slowly lifted his head and stared into the far, dark corner of the nursery, the one place the nightlight couldn't reach. His face was perfectly calm, empty of any childish emotion. He wasn't blinking. "Why is the man in the corner whispering your name?" he asked quietly. "You said you two don't know each other." I felt an icy cold crawl up my spine. I turned slowly. There was no one there. Just the deep shadow cast by the wardrobe. But that shadow, it seemed slightly denser than it should have been. And it was trembling, as if it were stifling a laugh. This happened to me 3 years ago in a suburb of Ohio. I still sleep with the lights on, and when I visit friends who have children, I never stay alone in a room. This isn't some internet horror story. This is the reason I will never work as a nanny again. Remember, homes aren't always as safe as they seem. It started as the most ordinary side job imaginable. I was a sophomore in college in Columbus back then, desperately short on cash. My scholarship barely covered my dorm fees, and I'd started to forget what decent food tasted like. So when an acquaintance who worked at a staffing agency sent me the contact for the Harrison family, I jumped at the chance without asking too many questions. They lived in an affluent, secluded part of Dublin, Ohio. You know the type of neighborhood, houses so far apart that if you screamed at night, the neighbors would just assume it was a coyote. Massive mansions hidden behind tall hedges, lawns so perfect they looked fake, and that unnatural, sterile silence hanging over everything. The Harrisons' house was impressive. 3 stories, colonial style, with enormous windows and a long gravel driveway. It was already getting dark when I arrived. An autumn wind was chasing dry leaves across the porch, and the old swing on the veranda creaked back and forth with a rhythmic sound that immediately made me uneasy. I chalked it up to nerves, though. "Mrs. Harrison answered the door. She was impeccably polite, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of rush, almost panic. She gave me a quick tour of the house. A kitchen the size of my apartment, a living room with a fireplace, endless hallways muffled by expensive carpets that swallowed every footstep. "Toby's already eaten," she said, pulling on her coat. "He's 5, a very calm boy. He usually just draws or plays in his room. Put him to bed at 9. We'll be back around 2 in the morning. Is that all right?" Of course, I smiled. "Don't worry." Mr. Harrison was already waiting in the car. Just before she walked out, Mrs. Harrison turned back. "And, Sarah." She hesitated. "If he starts telling strange stories." Just ignore him. His imagination has been a little overactive lately. The door clicked shut. The lock snapped into place. I was alone in this huge, echoing house with a 5-year-old I'd never met before. The first 2 hours were perfect. Toby really was a quiet child. Too quiet. He had large, serious eyes and pale skin. He sat on the living room carpet building a tower out of blocks. He didn't laugh, didn't throw things, didn't ask to watch cartoons. He just built, knocked it down, and built again. With the methodical focus of a little robot. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, but I felt uneasy. The house made sounds. That's normal for old buildings, I know. But these sounds were different. A floorboard creaking upstairs sounded like someone carefully shifting their weight from one foot to another. Every now and then, the ice maker in the kitchen would kick in, and the noise made me jump every single time. Around 8 o'clock, it started to rain. Not just rain, a full-on downpour, hammering the roof so hard it sounded like 1,000 fingers drumming on the tiles. Toby suddenly stopped playing. He was sitting with his back to me. "Do you hear it?" he asked. I looked up from my phone. "Hear what, sweetie? The rain?" No, he didn't turn around. The footsteps. I strained to listen. Silence, broken only by the rain and the refrigerator's hum. "I don't hear anything, Toby. We're the only ones here." He turned his head slowly. His gaze was heavy, adult. "They're upstairs. In Daddy's office." A shiver ran across my skin. I know kids make things up for attention, but his tone was so matter-of-fact it made my stomach clench. "There's no one up there," I said firmly, more for myself than for him. "Want a cookie?" We went to the kitchen. While Toby ate, I checked my phone. The signal was weak, only 1 bar. A message to my mom wouldn't send. I walked to the window, peering out into the darkness of the yard. The streetlights weren't on. Just black silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Suddenly, the baby monitor on the kitchen island, the receiver for the nursery upstairs, crackled to life. Through the white noise, a sound broke through. It wasn't crying. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a chair being pushed back. A heavy, wooden scrape across a hardwood floor. Right above our heads. I froze. Toby stopped chewing. "I told you," he whispered. "He's here." My first instinct was to grab the child and run outside. But logic took over. Old house. Drafts. Maybe a cat. I hadn't seen one, but rich people often have pets that hide. "Toby, stay here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to quickly check if a window came open." I grabbed a heavy flashlight from its stand, the only thing that could pass for a weapon, and headed for the stairs. Going up to the second floor was physically difficult. Each step felt like an effort, as if the air had grown thicker. The darkness upstairs felt almost tangible. I turned on the hallway light, but the bulbs were dim, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The door to Mr. Harrison's study was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered it being closed during the tour. I pushed it open with my foot. The flashlight beam swept across a massive oak desk, a leather armchair, bookshelves. No one. The window was closed. The chair was in place. I exhaled, feeling the adrenaline ebb away, leaving my knees weak. Just nerves, Sarah. Just an old, creaky house. I was about to leave when I noticed it. On the polished surface of the desk, right in the center, was a print. A bare footprint. Damp. It was too big for a child. And too narrow for a man. The toes were unnaturally long. I backed away, nearly tripping on the rug. My brain refused to process it. Maybe Mr. Harrison left it when he got out of the shower? But the print was wet. Fresh. I slammed the study door shut and hurried back downstairs. Toby was in the same spot, but now he was drawing. I walked over, trying to smile. "It's all right, Toby. Just the wind blowing the door open. Time to get ready for bed." He didn't argue. We went up to his room. I checked the closet, empty, looked under the bed, empty, and closed the curtains. "Leave the door open?" he asked, climbing under the covers. "I usually leave it cracked." "No. Wide open. He doesn't like it closed. He wants to see the hallway." I didn't ask who he was. I didn't want to know. I turned on the turtle nightlight that projected stars onto the ceiling and sat down in the armchair in the corner of the room. The parents had asked me to stay with him until he fell asleep. About 30 minutes passed. Toby lay still, staring at the ceiling. I was fighting off sleep and fear. The silence in the house had become oppressive. It felt like the walls were watching me. Then Toby spoke. "He's asking why you're scared." I jumped, dropping my phone. "What?" "Toby, go to sleep. He says he can feel your heart beating. Like a little bird's." I stood up. "Toby, stop it. This isn't funny. There's no one in here." The child sat up slowly in bed. He turned his head, not towards me, but towards that same dark corner behind the chair where I'd just been sitting. "He's standing right there," Toby said, pointing a finger past me. "He's smiling. He has too many teeth." I spun around. No one. But the air in that corner was freezing. I could feel it on my skin. And a smell. A faint odor of stagnant water and rotting leaves, a smell that had no place in a clean children's room. "Toby, we're going downstairs. Right now." I reached out to pick him up, but he pulled away. "We can't. He'll get mad. He wants to play the silence game." "What silence game?" "Whoever screams first loses. And whoever loses." Toby finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw real terror breaking through his calm facade. "He takes them into the wall." At that moment, the nightlight flickered and died. We were plunged into complete darkness. I heard it right next to my ear. A breath. A raspy, wet, rattling breath. like someone with a collapsed lung trying to gasp for air. And a whisper. Inhuman, made of clicks and hisses. SSSRRA. I screamed. I couldn't help it. I grabbed Toby, ignoring his resistance, and bolted for the door. The hallway seemed endless. The darkness was thick as syrup. The floor beneath me felt like it was becoming soft, spongy, like a bog. Behind us, from the nursery, came a crash. Like someone had violently overturned a heavy oak wardrobe. And then, rapid pattering. Thump 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 thump. It wasn't human footsteps. It sounded like something running on all fours, but with unnatural speed. I flew down the stairs, clutching Toby to my chest. He was silent. He was gripping my shirt so hard he probably left bruises. We burst into the kitchen. I looked for my car keys. Where were they? I'd left them on the counter. They weren't there. No, no, no. I whispered, groping across the cold marble. The baby monitor crackled to life again. The volume was turned all the way up. From the speaker came my own voice, recorded minutes earlier. There's no one up there, Toby. We're the only ones here. The recording cut off, and then came the laughter. Low, guttural, vibrating. He has the keys, Toby said quietly. He wants us to stay. I looked at the glass doors leading to the backyard. They were locked, but the glass. In the reflection, I could see the kitchen behind me. And I saw it. Standing in the doorway leading from the hall into the kitchen. It was tall, almost touching the door frame. Thin as a rail. Its limbs were unnaturally long, with extra joints. Its skin, gray, slick, like a drowned thing. Its face was hidden, except for the gaping hole of a mouth stretched into an impossible smile. It wasn't moving. It was just watching. I grabbed the biggest knife from the magnetic strip on the wall. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Don't look at it, Toby. Close your eyes. I backed toward the front door. It was locked with both a deadbolt and a chain. The creature took a step. Bones crunched. Another step. It moved in jerks, like a bad animation. One, and it was 3 meters closer. 2, and it was at the kitchen island. I spun to the front door, fumbling with the lock. It was stuck. The old mechanism had jammed. I could hear it approaching. I could smell the rot. Sarah. Toby whispered into my neck. It's here. In desperation, I slammed the knife handle against the glass panel beside the door. The glass shattered. I shoved my arm through, tearing my skin on the shards, trying to reach the lock from the other side. No, it was useless. I just knocked out the rest of the glass with my elbow. Climb through. I yelled at Toby. Run to the neighbors. Run and don't look back. I pushed him through the broken window. He tumbled out onto the porch, into the rain and mud. I started to climb after him. Something cold and wet clamped around my ankle. I screamed, digging my fingers into the wooden window frame. The force of the pull was monstrous. I was being dragged back into the darkness of the house. I kicked with my free foot, connecting with something hard and slick. I swung the knife and stabbed blindly backward, downward. The blade sank into something soft. A screech erupted, a sound that nearly burst my eardrums. It was the sound of metal scraping against glass, amplified 1,000 times. The grip loosened for a second. It was enough. I tumbled outside, landing on the concrete porch, scraping my knees raw. I scrambled up, grabbed Toby's hand, and we ran. We ran through the pouring rain, over gravel, across wet grass, towards the road. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I'd see it in the window. Or worse, running after us on those spider-like legs. We reached the road and I started waving at an approaching car. It was a police cruiser. The irony, they were just patrolling the neighborhood. When I, soaked, bloody, with a sobbing child in my arms, lunged towards the hood, the officer nearly dropped his coffee. The Harrisons came back an hour later. The police searched the house. They found nothing. No one was there. No footprint on the desk. The baby monitor was unplugged. The knife was on the kitchen counter, clean. The only evidence was the broken window by the door and the bruises shaped like long fingers on my ankle. The police took pictures, but I could see it in their faces. They thought I'd done it to myself. Or that someone I knew had done it, someone I'd let in. Mrs. Harrison wouldn't meet my eyes. She paid me, even more than we'd agreed on, and asked me never to come back. But just before I left, Toby came up to me. His parents were outside talking to the police. He tugged on my sleeve. He said to tell you hi, the boy whispered. Who, Toby? The man from the corner. He said he liked the way you scream. And that he kept a little piece of you. I didn't understand what he meant. I went home, took a hot shower, trying to wash off that smell of rot that seemed to have seeped into my pores. I went to sleep, leaving the light on. In the morning, I woke up to a pain in my leg. The one the thing had grabbed. I threw back the blanket. On my ankle, where the bruises had been, there was now a scar. A thin, white scar in the perfect shape of a smile. And under my bed, I found my lost phone. I opened the photo gallery. There was one new picture, taken at 3:00 a.m., when I was already home, in my locked apartment. It was a picture of me. Asleep. Taken from above. From the ceiling. From the darkest corner of my room. I've moved 5 times since then. I live in a tiny studio apartment with no dark corners. I sleep with a sleep mask on, because I'm afraid of waking up at night and seeing that the shadow from the wardrobe has become just a little denser than it should be. And sometimes, when it rains, I hear it. That wet, raspy breath right next to my ear. SSSRRA. Never ignore children when they say someone is watching them from the dark. Because sometimes, the dark is watching you, too.